Protests at the visit of former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to UCC as a guest of the MBA Association this week. In his new book, Does America Need a Foreign Policy?, Dr. Kissinger argues that America and Europe need each other now more than ever. But in the light of various European leaders distancing themselves from President Bush's axis of evil remarks, I asked him, does he now think that Europe and America are on a major foreign policy collision course?
Well, I think it would be a tragedy if Europe and America were on a collision course. And I am frankly disappointed that so many European leaders are taking so explicit a position. I think whether you agree with the exact words that President Bush used or not, he has called attention to a fundamental problem. And the problem is when weapons of mass destruction get into the hands of governments that have either used them or have advocated terrorism or have advocated hostage-taking and practiced hostage-taking, can you simply wait until they use them? Or is it necessary to find some formula and some means of preventing the acquisition of these stockpiles and the development of these stockpiles? That's an important question. And you can't just dismiss it by holding psychiatric discussions of the American state of mind.
So what do you think then is going on in the European mind?
Well, there are many factors. The European governments are now preoccupied with building Europe. So these involvements in the Middle East are an intrusion. Secondly, they're afraid of America getting involved in crises which then will affect them, which they cannot themselves control. This is an understandable point of view. But they should also consider that more frightening for Europe should be if the United States ignored these dangers and said, let's go ahead and build it up, and we ought to let it get built up. We ought to learn something from the 90s. In the 90s, it is really astonishing in retrospect that all the governments knew that there were at least 10,000 people training in Afghanistan, that there were training camps for terrorism, and the whole infrastructure of terrorism was created. And yet nobody did anything.
Can I stick with the 90s?
Including the United States.
Do you think in the 90s, President Clinton's period in office and its foreign policy was almost an aberration, the idea of nation building?
You know, it depends what you mean by nation building. It is sort of presumptuous for one nation to say, we know what it takes to build a nation. And especially when you deal in nations like Afghanistan. And also you have to have some historic understanding. When the Balkan crisis was really an outgrowth of hundreds of years of history, and without an understanding of the conflict between Islam and Christianity in the Balkans, and between the various empires that had ruled there, the individual events of the 90s were very hard to understand.
Can I throw a very 1990s phrase out at you? No two nations with McDonald's can ever go to war.
And that may be true for all we know.
But the point?
The point is the general view that is widely held is that that democratic nations don't go to war, or rich nations don't go to war. The latter is probably true, that if you have a high consumption society, that you then have a lower likelihood of going to war. The problem is, how do you get the societies that are now causing much of the trouble to become high consumption societies, and how do you bridge the period before they become high consumption societies, if that is indeed possible?
You mentioned the Balkans. Now, at the moment we have the Milosevic trial in The Hague. Now, your book examines rather critically the concept of universal justice.
Well, it depends what you mean by universal justice. When a tribunal is set up by the Security Council with a specific mission and a defined charter, I approve of it. And therefore the International Court for the Balkans, or whatever it's called, Yugoslavia, I agree with. I have the most severe doubts about the principle that individual judges in any country in the world can appoint themselves as prosecutors for anything they define as war crimes all over the world. That will lead to total arbitrariness, and it will lead to the politicization of universal justice. And it's really against what the advocates of universal justice attempt to achieve.
Now, some cynics would argue that the reason Henry Kissinger takes this view...
I won't even discuss this. I think that's despicable.
Now, final question. America, as we know, is the world's only superpower, but you've said this itself poses a challenge, and I quote you from your book. You say, the challenge is to recognize its own preeminence, but to conduct its policies as if it were still living in a world of many centers of power. Is President Bush enhancing this challenge?
I think that can be judged only after the policies have reached a certain fruition. And I am fundamentally sympathetic to what President Bush is attempting to do. And I think once he's better understood in Europe, more understanding for his policy will develop.
How will we understand it better?
Well, I think there will have to be an increasing dialogue on the now controversial issues, and one shouldn't judge the beginning of the dialogue by its conclusion.
Henry Kissinger, thank you very much indeed.